Jake Morrison stood at the window of his small transport ship and watched the massive space station grow larger in front of him. Nexus Prime was the biggest thing he had ever seen floating in space. The station was home to the Galactic Council, where 47 different alien species made decisions that affected billions of lives across the galaxy. Today, Jake would walk into that station as the only human representative Earth had ever sent. He was not what anyone expected an ambassador to look like. Jake was 34 years old with short brown hair and simple clothes. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life and then worked as a military planner. He had never been trained as a diplomat and did not know the fancy words that most ambassadors used. The leaders back on Earth had chosen him for different reasons. They needed someone who could think fast and read people well. They needed someone who would not be impressed by all the grand ceremonies and ancient traditions that filled the council chambers. Admiral Lisa Carter had given Jake his orders before he left Earth. Humanity needed to join the Galactic Council, or Earth would remain alone and weak in a dangerous galaxy. Without council membership, humans could not use the major trade routes or get help if enemies attacked Earth. The problem was that every species before humans had been rejected multiple times before finally getting accepted. Some species had waited 50 years or more. Earth could not wait that long. Jake walked through the docking bay of Nexus Prime and saw aliens everywhere. There were tall, thin beings made of what looked like living crystal. There were huge warriors, covered in thick armor plates that seemed to be part of their skin. Some aliens floated in the air without touching the ground while others moved on 6 or 8 legs. Jake had studied pictures of all these species, but seeing them in person was still strange. Most of them barely looked at him as he passed by. To them, he was just another representative from another small species trying to get noticed. The council chamber was even more impressive than the pictures had shown. The room was enormous with seats arranged in circles that went up toward a domed ceiling. Each section held representatives from different species, and their flags and symbols covered the walls. At the center sat the High Arbiter, the leader of the entire council. Zelkoroth was from the Dominion species and had been in charge of the council for over 20 years. He was old and proud and had seen hundreds of species come asking for membership. Jake found his assigned seat in a small section marked for visiting representatives. He was alone while most other species had large groups with them. He watched as the council members talked among themselves and conducted their daily business. They spoke about trade agreements and territorial disputes and dozens of other issues that Jake did not fully understand yet. What he did understand was how they treated each other. The older species acted like they owned the galaxy. They spoke slowly and used complicated words and seemed to enjoy making simple decisions take hours of discussion. The newer species sat quietly and waited for permission to speak. When they did get a chance to talk, the older members often ignored them or cut them off. Jake saw that this was not really about making good decisions for the galaxy. This was about power and keeping power in the hands of those who had always held it. After several hours of watching, High Arbiter Zelkoroth finally acknowledged Jake. The alien leader looked down at him from his high seat and spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. He welcomed Jake to Nexus Prime and said that the council would hear humanity's petition for membership in 7 standard cycles. Jake stood and thanked the High Arbiter politely. He said that humanity was honored to be considered and would prepare their case carefully. What Jake did not say was that he had no intention of preparing a traditional case at all. While Zelkoroth was speaking, Jake had been watching the other council members. He saw how some rolled their eyes when certain species spoke. He noticed which groups sat near each other and which ones stayed apart. He watched who paid attention during debates and who looked bored or frustrated. Jake had spent years as a military planner learning to read battlefields and enemy movements. The council chamber was just a different kind of battlefield. That evening, Jake sat in his small quarters aboard the human embassy ship and reviewed everything he had observed. Dr. Amy Rodriguez knocked on his door. She was the expert on alien cultures who was supposed to help him understand council traditions and protocols. She wanted to start working on humanity's presentation right away. Jake looked up from his notes and smiled. He told Amy that they would not be making the kind of presentation she expected. They were not going to spend 7 cycles listing human achievements and begging for acceptance. Instead, they were going to study every council member and find out what each of them really needed. Jake had realized something important during his first day in the council chamber. The other species had been trying to prove they deserved to join the council. Jake was going to prove that the council needed humanity more than humanity needed the council. Jake spent the next few days doing something that surprised everyone on his team. Instead of working on humanity's presentation, he attended every public event he could find on Nexus Prime. He went to cultural exchanges where different species shared their art and music. He visited trade negotiations where merchants argued over shipping contracts. He even showed up at informal gatherings where diplomats relaxed after their official duties ended. At every event, Jake mostly listened and watched. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was getting worried about Jake's approach. She found him one evening in the observation lounge of their ship reading reports on his tablet. She sat down across from him and asked why they were not working on their presentation about human achievements. Earth had sent detailed information about human technology, military victories, and scientific discoveries. Any normal ambassador would be organizing this information into an impressive display for the council. Jake looked up from his tablet and set it down on the table between them. He told Amy that this was not about what humans had accomplished. This was about what the council members needed humans to accomplish for them. Amy looked confused, so Jake explained what he had been learning during his visits around the station. The council was falling apart, and most of the members were too proud or too stuck in old ways to admit it. The problems were everywhere once Jake started looking for them. Trade disputes between species were taking years to resolve because every decision had to go through multiple committees. When pirates attacked merchant ships in remote systems, it took weeks for the council to approve military responses. By the time help arrived, the pirates were long gone and more ships had been attacked. Newer species that had joined the council recently were getting frustrated with how slowly everything moved. Jake had been particularly interested in watching the Korath delegation. These were powerful warriors whose species had joined the council 50 years ago. They were used to making quick decisions and taking fast action when problems arose. But the council's slow bureaucratic process drove them crazy. Jake had overheard several Korath representatives complaining loudly about the council's useless committee system. Commander Ben Hayes was Jake's security chief and had been gathering information from other security personnel on the station. He reported that tensions between different species were getting worse. The Zephyrians and the Veil-Touched had almost started fighting over mining rights. In a distant star system, the council had been trying to mediate their dispute for 6 months without making any progress. Both species were angry and frustrated, and their representatives barely spoke to each other anymore. Jake realized that every species that had tried to join the council before had made the same mistake. They focused on proving how great they were and why they deserved membership. But the council members did not care about how great new species were. They cared about their own problems and their own needs. Most of them were dealing with issues they could not solve using the council's ancient and complicated procedures. The breakthrough came when Jake started mapping out the relationships between different council members. He worked with Lieutenant Colonel Kate Sullivan, who was an intelligence officer trained to analyze complex political situations. Together they identified the key power brokers in the council and the issues that each group cared about most. They found that many species shared similar frustrations, even if they came from different parts of the galaxy. The economic data was particularly revealing. Many worlds that had been prosperous when they joined the council were now struggling because trade agreements took so long to negotiate and implement. Worlds that needed emergency supplies during natural disasters or other crises often had to wait months for help while council committees debated proper procedures. Species that had joined the council hoping for protection from enemies found that military aid was almost impossible to get quickly. Jake began to see patterns that the council members themselves seemed to miss. The Korath were frustrated with slow military responses. The Rim worlds needed faster economic agreements. The newer species wanted more voice in council decisions. The older species wanted to maintain their status, but were tired of dealing with endless complaints and problems. Everyone wanted the council to work better, but nobody knew how to fix it. Dr. Rodriguez started to understand what Jake was thinking, but she was still worried about the ethics of his approach. She asked him directly if they were planning to manipulate the council members. Jake thought about her question carefully before answering. He said they were not manipulating anyone. They were going to give each species what they actually needed, instead of what they thought they wanted. Every other species had tried to prove they deserved membership. Jake was going to prove that membership was not something to be given as a reward, but something that should be earned by making the council work better for everyone. The real test of Jake's theory came when he decided to get involved in a minor dispute that had been dragging on for weeks. The agricultural world of Harvest 7 needed emergency food supplies because their crops had failed during an unusual weather pattern. The world's representative had submitted proper requests through all the correct council channels, but the approval process was stuck in committee reviews. Meanwhile, people on Harvest 7 were starting to go hungry. Jake contacted the Verdanian delegate who represented Harvest 7 and offered to help. He suggested that human cargo ships could deliver the needed supplies immediately while the official paperwork was still being processed. The Verdanian was surprised by the offer, but desperate enough to accept. Within 2 days, human ships were unloading food supplies on Harvest 7. The council committees approved the aid request a week later. Word of Jake's intervention spread quickly through the diplomatic community on Nexus Prime. Some council members were impressed by human efficiency and willingness to act quickly. Others were annoyed that proper procedures had been bypassed. High Arbiter Zelkoroth summoned Jake for a private meeting and warned him not to interfere with council business. Jake apologized politely and promised to respect council authority, but he was already planning his next move. Jake did not let the warning from High Arbiter Zelkoroth stop him from helping solve problems around Nexus Prime. He was more careful about how he approached things, but he kept finding ways to assist council members who were struggling with the slow bureaucratic system. Each time he offered help, Jake made sure to respect official procedures while finding creative ways to get results faster than normal. The next opportunity came when Jake learned about a trade route dispute between 3 different species. The Nexari, Tellurians, and Koroth all claimed rights to use the same shipping lanes through a strategically important star system. The council had been trying to mediate this dispute for 8 months. Each species had filed hundreds of pages of legal documents and historical claims. The mediation committee met twice a week to review evidence and listen to arguments, but they were no closer to a solution than when they started. Jake studied the dispute carefully and realized that all 3 species were arguing about the wrong thing. They were fighting over who had the right to control the shipping lanes, when what they really needed was a way for all of them to use the lanes safely and profitably. The current system was hurting everyone because ships had to take longer alternative routes. While the dispute continued, he arranged separate meetings with representatives from each species. Jake never claimed to be mediating officially or representing the council in any way. He simply listened to each group explain their concerns and needs. The Nexari were worried about protecting their merchant vessels from pirates who had been attacking ships in the disputed area. The Tellurians needed reliable access to the routes because their economy depended on trade with distant worlds. The Koroth wanted to ensure their patrol ships could move through the area quickly when responding to threats. After several days of private conversations, Jake proposed a solution that addressed everyone's real concerns. Instead of fighting over who controlled the shipping lanes, the 3 species could work together to patrol and protect them. The Koroth had the best military ships for dealing with pirates. The Tellurians had the most advanced navigation technology for keeping ships safe. The Nexari had the largest merchant fleet and could coordinate shipping schedules to avoid conflicts. Jake suggested they form a joint patrol and management system for the disputed routes. Each species would contribute what they did best and all 3 would benefit from safer and more efficient shipping. The proposal was so practical and beneficial that representatives from all 3 species agreed to try it. They signed a preliminary agreement within a week and began implementing the joint system. Immediately, the success of Jake's informal mediation impressed many council members, but also created more concerns among the traditional leadership. Some species started coming to Jake directly when they had problems, instead of going through official council channels. This made the bureaucrats and committee leaders nervous, because it suggested their complicated procedures were not necessary. Commander Denny Cooper was Jake's communications officer and had been monitoring diplomatic chatter around the station. He reported that several council members were starting to ask questions about humanity's real intentions. Some thought humans were trying to undermine council authority by bypassing official procedures. Others wondered if humans had some secret agenda that involved taking power away from established leaders. Jake knew he had to be even more careful about how he operated. He did not want to be seen as a threat to the council's authority before humanity even had a chance to join. But he also could not stop helping solve problems, because that was the foundation of his entire strategy. He decided to start working more closely with existing council structures while still finding ways to make them more effective. The breakthrough came when Jake offered to help the council's emergency response committee improve their procedures for dealing with crises. This committee was supposed to coordinate aid when disasters struck member worlds, but their response times were terrible. Committee members spent weeks debating proper protocols while people suffered unaffected worlds. Jake approached the committee chairman with a detailed analysis of recent emergency responses. He showed how human logistics methods could reduce response times from weeks to days without changing any of the council's official authority structures. The committee could still make all the important decisions, but they could use human organizational techniques to implement those decisions much faster. The committee chairman was initially skeptical, but agreed to a small trial run. When the next emergency call came, the committee used Jake's suggested procedures to coordinate their response. Relief supplies reached the affected world for days instead of the usual 3 weeks. The results were so impressive that other committees started asking Jake for similar advice. Dr. Amy Rodriguez watched these developments with growing amazement and concern. She had originally worried that Jake was moving too slowly and not preparing properly for humanity's formal hearing. Now she was worried that he was moving too fast and making too many changes before humans were even official council members. She asked Jake what would happen if the council rejected humanity's membership application. After all the help he had provided, Jake had thought about this possibility many times. He told Amy that rejection was always a risk, but the traditional approach of begging for membership had an even higher chance of failure. At least his way was creating real value for council members. If humanity was rejected, they would leave behind a legacy of improved procedures and solved problems. More importantly, Jake believed that many council members would support human membership once they saw how much humans could contribute. The real test of Jake's strategy came when the most serious crisis yet hit the council. A massive solar flare had damaged the main communication relay system that connected dozens of worlds in the inner rim. Without this system, many worlds were cut off from the rest of the galaxy and could not coordinate trade or call for help if they needed it. The repair job required ships and equipment from multiple species working together in a carefully coordinated effort. Under normal council procedures, organizing such a complex operation would take months of planning and committee approvals. The affected worlds could not wait that long. Jake saw this as an opportunity to prove that human organizational methods could handle large-scale emergencies that traditional council bureaucracy could not manage effectively. He volunteered to coordinate the repair operation using human logistics techniques while respecting all council authority structures. The emergency committee would still make the important decisions about resource allocation and priorities. Jake would simply organize the practical implementation of those decisions. Using methods designed for maximum speed and efficiency, the operation was a complete success. Ships and repair crews from 15 different species worked together smoothly. Under Jake's coordination, the communication relay system was fully restored in 10 days instead of the estimated 6 weeks. Council members from across the galaxy praised the operation as the most effective emergency response in the Council's recent history. The success of the communication relay repair operation changed everything for Jake and the human delegation. Word spread quickly through the Council about how a human had coordinated the most effective emergency response in decades. Species that had barely acknowledged Jake's presence before were now requesting meetings with him. Even some of the older and more traditional Council members admitted privately that human methods had achieved impressive results. Jake's reputation within the Council had grown far beyond what anyone expected from a first-time petitioner. He was no longer seen as just another representative from a small species hoping to join the galactic community. Council members now viewed him as someone who could solve problems that their own systems had failed to handle. This was exactly the position Jake had been working toward since his first day on Nexus Prime. As humanity's formal hearing approached, Jake felt confident about his strategy, but he knew the most difficult challenges were still ahead. High Arbiter Zelkorath had been watching Jake's activities with growing concern. The Dominion leader understood that human success in solving Council problems was also in criticism of traditional Council methods. If humans could make the system work better, it suggested that the old ways were inadequate. Lieutenant Colonel Kate Sullivan had been monitoring the political reactions to Jake's interventions. She reported that Council members were divided into three main groups. One group was impressed with human effectiveness and wanted humanity to join the Council as soon as possible. Another group was suspicious of human motives and worried that humans were trying to change too much too quickly. The third group was waiting to see what happened at the formal hearing before deciding which side to support. The traditional Council leadership was definitely in the suspicious category. They had built their power and influence on their mastery of the complex bureaucratic procedures that Jake kept bypassing or improving. If the Council adopted human-style efficiency methods, many of these leaders would lose the special knowledge and connections that made them important. They had strong reasons to oppose humanity's membership even if they could not argue against the results humans had achieved. Jake knew that his formal presentation to the Council would be the most important speech of his life. Every other species had used their hearing to list their achievements and explain why they deserved membership. Jake planned to do something completely different that would shock the Council and force them to make a choice they had never faced before. Captain Roy Fisher commanded the human escort vessel that had brought Jake to Nexus Prime. He had been watching the political situation develop with the practical eye of a military officer. He warned Jake that success in helping individual Council members did not guarantee support. During the formal vote, politics was different from problem solving, and many species might vote against humanity for reasons that had nothing to do with human effectiveness. Jake agreed that the formal hearing would be unpredictable, but he believed his strategy had created the best possible conditions for success. Traditional petitioners had to convince Council members that they deserved membership based on their past achievements. Jake had convinced many Council members that they needed human membership based on future benefits. Need was a much stronger motivation than fairness or tradition. The week before the hearing, Jake received an unexpected visitor. High Arbiter Zelkorath came to the human embassy ship for a private conversation. The Dominion leader rarely visited other delegations, and his presence created quite a stir among Jake's staff. Zelkorath dismissed everyone except Jake so they could speak alone. The High Arbiter was direct about his concerns. He told Jake that while human assistance had been helpful in several situations, the Council's traditional procedures existed for important reasons. The slow, careful process of building consensus among dozens of different species prevented hasty decisions that might cause conflicts later. Human efficiency methods might solve immediate problems, but they could create larger problems by moving too fast and ignoring important cultural differences. Jake listened respectfully to these arguments and acknowledged that Zelkorath raised valid points about the dangers of changing established systems too quickly. But he also pointed out that the current system was failing to serve the needs of many Council members. The communication relay crisis had shown that some situations required faster responses than traditional procedures could provide. The choice was not between perfect traditional methods and dangerous human methods. But between systems that worked and systems that did not work, Zelkoroth left the meeting without making any commitments, but Jake could tell the old leader was troubled by the conversation. The High Arbiter had expected to find an ambitious human trying to gain power and influence. Instead, he found someone who seemed genuinely focused on making the council work better for everyone. This was actually more dangerous to traditional leadership than simple ambition would have been. The day of the formal hearing arrived, and the council chamber was packed with representatives from every member species. Many had brought additional staff to witness what everyone expected would be either a routine rejection or possibly the most unusual petition in council history. Jake walked into the chamber alone, carrying only a small data tablet with his presentation notes. High Arbiter Zelkoroth called the session to order and announced that the council would hear humanity's petition for membership. He invited Jake to present humanity's case according to traditional procedures. Species petitioning for membership normally had several hours to present detailed information about their achievements, technology, military capabilities, and potential contributions to the galactic community. Jake stood at the speaker's podium in the center of the chamber and looked around at the assembled delegates. He could see the expectation in their faces. Some were preparing to listen politely to another routine petition. Others were curious to see if the human who had been solving their problems would make a conventional presentation after all. A few looked nervous because they suspected Jake had something unprecedented planned. Jake began his presentation by thanking the council for considering humanity's petition and acknowledging the honor of appearing before such a distinguished assembly. Then he said something that stunned the entire chamber into silence. He announced that he was not going to ask the council to grant humanity membership. Instead, he was going to request something that no species had ever requested before. Jake proposed that humanity be granted a 6-month trial membership, during which humans would take over the council's administrative operations and demonstrate measurable improvements in efficiency and effectiveness. If humanity failed to deliver significant improvements within 6 months, they would withdraw their membership application permanently and never reapply. If they succeeded, the council could vote on permanent membership based on proven results, rather than promises. The audacity of the proposal sent shock waves through the chamber. No species had ever suggested that the council itself needed improvement, let alone offered to prove they could improve it. Several senior delegates looked offended while others leaned forward with intense interest. The chamber erupted in confused conversations as delegates tried to understand what Jake was really proposing. The council chamber had never seen anything like the chaos that followed Jake's unprecedented proposal. Delegates were shouting questions and arguing with each other. While High Arbiter Zelkoroth tried to restore order, some species were outraged that a petitioning species would dare suggest that the council needed fixing. Others were intrigued by the possibility of actually improving the slow and frustrating systems they dealt with every day. Jake stood calmly at the speaker's podium, waiting for the noise to die down. He had expected this reaction and was prepared to explain his proposal in detail. When Zelkoroth finally managed to quiet the chamber, Jake continued his presentation by outlining specific improvements humanity could make to council operations. He presented data showing how emergency response times could be cut from weeks to days, how trade disputes could be resolved in months instead of years, and how bureaucratic delays could be reduced by an average of 70%. The numbers were impressive, but many council members remained skeptical. The Zephyrian delegate stood up and asked how humans could possibly understand the complex political and cultural factors that made council procedures necessary. The slow consensus building process was not just bureaucracy, but a way of ensuring that all species felt heard and respected. Moving too fast might improve efficiency, but could damage the delicate relationships that held the galactic community together. Jake had anticipated this objection and was ready with his response. He agreed that cultural sensitivity and political balance were crucial for the council's success, but he argued that the current system was actually damaging relationships by frustrating species who needed help and could not get it quickly enough. The communication relay crisis had shown that some situations required faster responses, regardless of political sensitivities. Human methods could provide that speed while still respecting council authority and decision-making processes. The Koroth delegate was the first to speak in favor of Jake's proposal. He stood up and declared that his species had been complaining about council inefficiency for decades without seeing any improvements. If humans could actually deliver the changes they promised, the Koroth would support, giving them a chance to try. Several other delegates from newer council member species nodded their agreement. High Arbiter Zel-Koroth realized that Jake's proposal was gaining support and called for a recess so delegates could discuss the situation privately. During the break, Jake was surrounded by representatives asking detailed questions about his plans. Some wanted to know exactly which procedures would be changed and how human methods would be implemented. Others were more interested in the political implications of accepting such an unusual arrangement. Commander Danny Cooper watched the scene with amazement. He had never seen council delegates so energized and engaged in discussing a membership petition. Usually these hearings were polite, but boring affairs where everyone knew the outcome in advance. Jake had turned the entire process upside down by making the council members themselves the focus of debate rather than humanity's qualifications. When the session resumed, Zel-Koroth asked several pointed questions about Jake's proposal. He wanted to know who would oversee the human administration of council operations and what would happen if conflicts arose between human efficiency and traditional procedures. Jake explained that all major policy decisions would still be made by elected council leadership. Humans would only manage the implementation and administrative aspects of those decisions. The debate continued for hours as delegates raised concerns and Jake provided detailed answers. Some worried that 6 months was not enough time to fairly evaluate such major changes. Jake responded that 6 months was long enough to demonstrate clear improvements and short enough to minimize risks if the experiment failed. Others questioned whether humanity had the expertise to manage operations for such a diverse galactic community. Jake pointed to the recent successes in emergency response and problem-solving that had already proven human capabilities. The most difficult questions came from the traditional leadership faction. They argued that Jake's proposal was essentially asking the council to admit that centuries of established procedures were wrong. Jake carefully avoided directly criticizing traditional methods and instead focused on the need to adapt to changing circumstances. The galaxy had become more complex and interconnected since many council procedures were first established. What worked in the past might need updating to serve current needs. As the debate stretched into the evening, it became clear that the council was genuinely divided on Jake's proposal. This was not the routine rejection that most observers had expected. The idea of actually trying to improve council operations rather than just accepting their limitations was appealing to many delegates who had grown frustrated with the current system. Dr. Helen Garcia had arrived from Earth with a team of efficiency experts ready to implement Jake's plans if the council approved his proposal. She watched the proceedings from the gallery and could see that Jake had successfully shifted the entire focus of the membership debate. Instead of arguing about whether humanity deserved to join, the council delegates were arguing about whether the council deserved to continue operating the way it always had. The final speeches before the vote revealed how deeply Jake's proposal had affected the council's thinking. The Verdanian delegate spoke about how human assistance had saved lives on Harvest 7, when traditional procedures would have been too slow. The Tellurian representative described the successful joint patrol system that had solved the shipping lane dispute. Even some traditionally conservative delegates acknowledged that recent human interventions had produced impressive results. High Arbiter Zel-Koroth made the final speech before the vote. He acknowledged that Jake's proposal was unprecedented and raised important questions about council operations. He also warned that accepting such an unusual arrangement could set dangerous precedents for future membership petitions. But he admitted that the evidence of human effectiveness in solving practical problems was difficult to ignore. The vote was conducted by secret ballot to allow delegates to support their genuine preferences without political pressure from their allies. Jake watched tensely as the ballots were collected and counted. Everything he had worked for during his months on Nexus Prime would be decided by this single vote. When Zelkoroth announced the results, the chamber fell completely silent. 24 delegates had voted in favor of accepting Jake's trial membership proposal. 23 had voted against it. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. Humanity had been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council with the specific mandate to demonstrate improvements in Council operations within 6 months. Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he realized his gamble had succeeded. He had gotten humanity into the Council, but now he had to prove that human methods could actually deliver the improvements he had promised. The real work was just beginning, and failure would mean not just rejection, but permanent exclusion from ever applying again. Jake wasted no time putting his plans into action. After the Council approved humanity's trial membership, within days of the vote, human efficiency experts were working with Council staff to analyze current procedures and identify areas for improvement. Dr. Helen Garcia led the technical implementation, while Jake focused on managing the political aspects of the massive changes they were making to centuries-old systems. The results began showing up almost immediately. Trade dispute cases that had been sitting in committee review for months were suddenly moving toward resolution. Emergency aid requests were being processed in days instead of weeks. Military response authorizations that normally required multiple committee approvals were being streamlined through new rapid decision protocols. The improvements were so dramatic that even skeptical Council members had to admit that human methods were producing real benefits. Not everyone was happy with the changes. The Dominion faction led by High Arbiter Zelkoroth watched the human reforms with growing alarm. They understood that Jake's success was undermining their traditional sources of power and influence. The complex bureaucratic procedures that humans were simplifying had been the foundation of the old guard's control over Council operations. If any species could get things done quickly and efficiently, the special knowledge and connections of veteran politicians became much less valuable. The traditionalists began organizing resistance to the human reforms by arguing that the changes were happening too fast and ignoring important cultural considerations. They pointed out that the Council's slow consensus-building process had prevented major conflicts for centuries by ensuring that all voices were heard before important decisions were made. Moving too quickly might solve immediate problems, but could create larger issues by making some species feel ignored or excluded. Commander Ben Hayes reported that tensions between the reform supporters and traditionalists were escalating beyond normal political disagreements. Some Dominion allies were actively trying to sabotage human initiatives by filing procedural complaints and demanding lengthy review processes for every change. They seemed more interested in proving that human methods could not work than in actually solving the problems those methods were designed to address. The real test of Jake's reforms came when a major humanitarian crisis erupted in the Tau sector. A massive asteroid impact had devastated 3 inhabited worlds, and millions of people needed immediate evacuation and medical assistance. Under traditional Council procedures, organizing such a large-scale response would have taken weeks of committee meetings and resource negotiations. The affected populations did not have weeks to wait. Jake activated the new emergency response protocols that human experts had developed during their first month of Council administration. Instead of waiting for committee approvals, rescue ships from multiple species were dispatched within hours of receiving the distress calls. Medical supplies and evacuation transports were coordinated through the streamlined logistics system that had proven so effective during the communication relay repairs. Relief operations were underway. While traditional procedures would still have been scheduling their first planning meeting, the Tau sector response saved hundreds of thousands of lives and demonstrated beyond doubt that human administrative methods could handle large-scale emergencies more effectively than traditional Council bureaucracy. Even some of Jake's harshest critics had to acknowledge that the speed and coordination of the relief effort had been impressive. The results spoke for themselves in a way that political arguments could not match. As the 6-month trial period approached its end, Jake began preparing for the final evaluation that would determine humanity's permanent membership status. The data was overwhelmingly positive. Emergency response times had improved by 85%. Trade dispute resolution was happening 70% faster. Member satisfaction surveys showed dramatic increases in approval ratings for council. Effectiveness. Even the most stubborn traditionalists could not argue with numbers that clear. But Jake knew that the final vote would not be decided purely on technical performance. Politics and personal relationships would also play important roles in determining which delegates supported permanent human membership. High Arbiter Zel'Korath and his allies had spent months building opposition to the human reforms. By arguing that rapid change threatened the stability of the galactic order, the traditionalist faction made their final attempt to derail human membership by calling for a vote of no confidence in the reforms themselves. If the council rejected the new administrative systems, humanity's trial membership would be considered a failure regardless of the measurable improvements they had achieved. This was a clever political strategy that forced council members to choose between efficiency and tradition rather than simply evaluating human performance. Jake realized that this vote would determine not just humanity's membership, but the future direction of the entire Galactic Council. If the traditionalists won, they would roll back all the improvements humans had made and return to the old slow, inefficient systems. If the reformers won, it would represent a fundamental shift toward practical effectiveness over bureaucratic tradition. Standing before the full council for what might be his final speech, Jake decided to make the choice as clear as possible for every delegate. He did not defend human achievements or argue for membership based on what humanity deserved. Instead, he challenged the council members to decide what kind of institution they wanted to represent them in the galaxy. Jake pointed to the data displays showing the dramatic improvements in council performance over the past 6 months. He reminded delegates about the lives saved during the Tau Sector crisis and the problems solved that had been festering for years under the old system. Then he asked the simple question that cut through all the political complexity. Did they want a council that worked or a council that preserved tradition, even when tradition meant failure? The speech was shorter than most delegates expected, but it was also more direct than any membership petition they had ever heard. Jake was not asking for charity or appealing to fairness. He was asking the council to choose between proven results and comfortable procedures, between solving problems and avoiding change, between effectiveness and tradition. The final vote was closer than the technical performance data suggested it should have been. Political loyalty and personal relationships influenced some delegates more than objective evidence. But in the end, 26 council members voted to continue the human reforms and grant permanent membership, while 21 voted to return to traditional procedures. High Arbiter Zel'Korath announced the results with obvious reluctance, but he respected the democratic process that had governed the council for centuries. Humanity was officially welcomed as the 48th member species of the Galactic Council. More importantly, the council had voted to embrace a new approach that prioritized practical effectiveness over bureaucratic tradition. Jake watched the ceremonial induction that formally completed humanity's membership and reflected on what they had actually accomplished. They had not just gained access to the galactic community, they had changed how that community operated and proved that sometimes the best way to honor tradition was to make it work better for everyone it was supposed to serve. Dr. Amy Rodriguez approached Jake after the ceremony and asked what came next. Now that humanity had achieved full council membership, Jake smiled as he thought about the dozen other galactic institutions that could benefit from human practical thinking and organizational methods. The council had been just the beginning. Now they could start working on the real challenges of making the galaxy a better place for all the species that called it home.